Good evening. My name is Malcolm Smith. I'm from Foxtel. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight and thank you for coming. The Foxtel Screenwriters Address is presented together with the Australian Writers Foundation at the Wheeler Centre. And this is the fifth address in the series. We've had Catherine Thompson, John Doyle, Geoffrey Atherton and John Colley. And tonight I'm very pleased that we've got Andrew Bovell to talk to us. I won't talk long. I just wanted to thank Geoffrey Atherton and Jacqueline Elaine for all their help and support in building the very close relationship that Foxtel has with the Writers Foundation and the Writers Guild. And Foxtel is very proud to support and nurture talent and excellence. And we really recognised screenwriting and writing in general as being a really central and important craft. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Geoffrey Atherton. I'm president of the Australian Writers Foundation. And there are three projects we run with Foxtel. The first is the Foxtel Fellowship, which is a $25,000 grant that's given to a writer with a significant body of work, so that the writer can develop a project of their own choosing. The second is an oral history program. We've been recording the oral history of Australia's significant writers for performance, for stage, for radio, for television, for film. And we've done, I think, about 16 writers so far, and they're all, the footage for this, which comes from Foxtel, is all stored at the National Film and Sound Archives, and in fact excerpts from three of the speakers, from me, from David Williamson and from Tony Morfitt, can be accessed on the National Film and Sound Archives website. And the third thing we do with Foxtel is this Foxtel Australian Writers Foundation address, an annual address. It's an opportunity for a writer to say something about the business of writing, to say something about our place, the place of writers, in the cultural, social, political landscape that we live in and work in. And this year the address has been given by Andrew Bovell. When you look at Andrew's CV, you could easily think, boy, this guy knows how to pick award-winning projects to work on. With movie credits that include Strictly Ballroom and Head On and Lantana, Andrew has contributed to some of Australia's most significant films. And in theatre, Speaking in Tongues, Holy Day, and When the Rain Stops Falling have all had extensive national tours and seasons, and have also been toured internationally as well. And this national and international success has brought Andrew commissions from theatre companies and film producers in America and in Britain. He adapted Troy Kennedy Martin's amazing piece of television, Edge of Darkness, for the big screen that was released last year. He's just completed adapting John le Carré's novel, A Most Wanted Man, which is nearing the end of its production in the UK. And he's just completed an adaptation of Kate Grenville's The Secret River for the Sydney Theatre Company, which opens in January in Sydney at the Sydney Theatre. And his international theatre success has led to a joint commission from the Steppenwolf Theatre Company of Chicago and the National Theatre in London. The few titles that I've mentioned are only a handful of Andrew's credits, and I haven't even touched on his many television credits. I'm sure Andrew will want to point out that some of these are shared credits, shared with other writers, but I think that only demonstrates that Andrew is a writer who works very well with other writers. And that's not something that we can say about all of us. He's been writing since 1986, and his output has been impressive in both senses of the word. There's been a lot of it, and it's all been very good. It's some years now since Andrew joined the ranks of Australia's elite writers, significant writers, respected writers, and so, with great pleasure, I introduce to give this year's 2012 Foxtel Australian Writers Foundation address, Andrew Bovell.
Get the right glasses on. Funny things happen to writers in taxis. You know the story. A writer gets into a taxi and you establish the destination and it clears the airport. Then the driver asks the inevitable question, "Here on business?" And you say, "Yeah," hoping that will be the end of it, but knowing it won't be. And he says, "What do you do?" And you think about lying. What could I be? A teacher, an academic, a businessman? But you tell the truth and you say, "I'm a writer." And he says, "Yeah? What do you write?" And at this point in the conversation, I have noticed one of two things happen. If I say I'm a playwright, the conversation usually ends there, sometimes with a look of pity or disappointment. But if I say I write for film, it's like a door opens and the conversation really begins. This says something about the audience reach of the two mediums. Taxi drivers don't go to the theatre much, but everybody has a relationship to film. Everybody wants to talk about it. And the taxi driver and taxi drivers being taxi drivers inevitably ask, "So what films have you written?" And your heart sinks a little because you've had this conversation before and you know how it ends. It's a test, you see. Are you somebody, he's asking. You mention a title. "Nah, I didn't see that one." You mention another. "Nah, I didn't see that one either." You mention another and he says, "Heard of it, but nah, I didn't see it." And so you end up feeling like the screenwriter of all the films that no one saw. And perhaps that's the story of most Australian screenwriters. Once I thought I would pass this unspoken test of worth. I had written Edge of Darkness, an American adaptation of the seminal Troy Kennedy Martin British television series. It had not been an easy experience, but I thought I could at least use it to impress a taxi driver. So I said I wrote a film for Mel Gibson once, and the taxi driver was silent. So I thought to elaborate. He was in Mad Max and Braveheart. "Yeah, I know," he said. "I don't watch his films." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I'm Jewish." And so they go, these conversations with taxi drivers. Even when you think you're somebody, you just end up feeling like nobody. Better to lie, perhaps, and to say that I'm a teacher, an academic, a businessman, a landscape gardener. Sometimes I wish I was a landscape gardener, out in the sun all day, in a garden, instead of a dark office with the blinds drawn, the only source of light coming from the laptop screen, empty coffee cups, the crusts of yesterday's sandwich, unpaid bills, notes scrawled on pieces of paper, and a line of emails reminding me that the draft was due last month. Actually, I have been mistaken for somebody in a taxi 3 times. Once in Sydney, the driver said, "Aren't you that bloke?" "What bloke?" I said. "That bloke on the ABC does the Q&A thing." And I think I'd quite like to be Tony Jones. He's smart and good-looking and I like his show. But I tell the truth and say, no, I'm not Tony Jones. And once in Perth, I was wearing a suit on the way to a funeral, actually. Funerals and the orgies being the only time I wear a suit. And the taxi driver said, "I don't agree with what they did to you, Gillard and her mob." And I think about it for a moment and I realise he thinks I'm Kevin Rudd. And once I wouldn't have minded being mistaken for Kevin Rudd. I was moved when he stood in our national parliament and did what his predecessor had refused to do for so long, apologise to Indigenous Australians for the wrongs of history. I was proud to be an Australian at that moment. But he lost me when he described the work of the respected Australian artist Jim Henson as disgusting and revolting. Pride turned to shame then, to think that we could be led by such a small-minded man. Far better to have said something like, "Well, they are not images I respond to, and I can understand why some people are offended by them and why they have provoked a sense of concern within some parts of the community. But isn't that the role of art? Isn't that what we should expect of art? To provoke us, to make us think about the world we live in and the values we hold? Isn't that what art should do?" The third time I was mistaken for being somebody in a taxi was here in Melbourne, heading down the Tullamarine. The driver said, "The Labor Party has gone to the dogs since you were there." And I said, I'm not Kevin Rudd. And he said, I know, you're Graham Richardson, aren't you? From Tony Jones to Graham Richardson, there's a lesson there. It might go something like, stop smoking, drink less, and exercise more. It's the glasses and it's the grey hair, of course. But mostly it's the hair. Tony, Kev, Graham and me. My hair turned grey in my late 20s. I tell my kids it was their fault. It was the shock of them coming into the world, the shock of becoming a father. But it's not true. I think I went grey because I'm a writer and I worry. The question is, did I become a writer because I worry? And essentially that's what I want to talk to you about today, the worry of being a writer. I want to thank Geoffrey Atherton and the Australian Writers Foundation and the Australian Writers Guild, and particularly Foxtel, Richard Freudenstein and Malcolm Smith for this opportunity to speak to you. I think if you accept an invitation like this to take up public space, then the onus is on you to speak of matters of significance, or at least to attempt to. And so that's what I want to do. I want to speak frankly. I want to speak truthfully about this thing I do called writing, about the worry of it and the joys of it, about the mistakes I have made and the things I have learned, about the things that can go wrong and the things that can go right. And along the way, hopefully canvass some of the bigger questions we face. And I want to speak about that thing that I wish Kevin Rudd had the grace to have said. I want to speak to you about writing as art, as something that can provoke us to think about the world we live in and the values we hold, as something that reflects who we are and suggests who we should be, as something that gives expression to the great themes of the day and that makes sense of the world we live in. And I want to pose this question. As screenwriters, is that what we aspire to do? Is that what is expected of us? Or is our job to tell a bloody good story, preferably in 3 acts with a damn good crisis and a redemptive ending, which gives the audience a sense of hope and makes as much money as possible for the investors and the distributors of the film? Art versus commerce. It's one of the great tensions in what we do. Are they opposites and enemies, or can great cinema be a fusion of the two? Recently, I attended a guild function in Adelaide, and somebody asked me what I was working on. As it happened, I was finalising the production script of A Most Wanted Man. I laid out the credentials of the project. It is an adaptation of a John le Carré novel for the Dutch director and photographer Anton Corbijn, whose 2 previous films had been Control, the haunting black and white biopic of Ian Curtis, the lead singer of Joy Division, and more recently the George Clooney film The American. The film is currently shooting in Hamburg with Philip Seymour Hoffman, Rachel McAdams, William Dafoe, Robin Wright, Daniel Bruhl, among others. It's a great cast, a great project, and working with Anton has been a joy. And then the guy I was talking to said, right, so you've become a gun for hire? And I laughed and said, yeah, I guess I have. But as I was driving home that night, I found myself thinking, worrying, what does that mean, a gun for hire? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Is that what I've become? Somebody who just writes other people's stories? It had a slightly negative connotation, as though I wrote for hire for the biggest bidder, like some paid mercenary who fights without thought of just cause, and just as quickly changes sides if the other side pays more. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be seen as that. And then it happened. A big hole opened up in the road before me, the Southern Expressway for those who know Adelaide. And I drove straight over the edge, straight into the dark pit of despair, screaming, who am I? Why do I do this? I'm just a gun for hire. I fell into film. I like to think that I would have found my way there eventually, but I wasn't looking for it. It wasn't the goal, so to speak. I was in my 20s, a playwright living in Melbourne, starting to go grey, a part of the Melbourne Workers' Theatre ensemble. I lived and breathed theatre. I wore black and I smoked Dr. Pat tobacco. And I happened to have a play on in town. It was called After Dinner. Unusual for me, it was a comedy. And Baz Luhrmann happened to see it, and the next thing I knew, I was co-writing an odd little film called Strictly Ballroom. Now here's the thing. I was every bit the serious young Melbourne playwright, and Baz was not. He was the opposite, the flamboyant Sydney director. How's this going to work, I thought. Well, it kind of did, strangely, for a while. I mentioned that I was part of the Melbourne Workers' Theatre. For those who don't know it, it was a left-wing theatre company that began its life as a one-off theatre project based at the Jolimont Train Maintenance Yards, now the Tennis Centre. It was a period of transition in the workplace as the conditions of workers were being eroded by the rise of economic rationalism. Our job was to work with the workers in order to create a series of plays that gave voice to their stories and concerns in those tumultuous times. That was my training as a playwright, to give voice to the stories of others, particularly those who weren't heard. And I've never quite shaken that training. It still shapes the way I approach my work. And suddenly there I was in Sydney working on a film about ballroom dancing. How would I do this? From the Dickensian industrial world of the Jolimont train yard to the glittering world of ballroom dancing. You could not find two more different worlds. Except they weren't as different as you might think. They were both worlds that belonged to the working class. And then I knew what I had to do. Strictly Ballroom would be a film about class. And so I presented my scenario to Baz. Scott Hastings, the film's protagonist, played by Paul Mercurio, worked at a steel mill in Wollongong by day and danced by night. The steel mill was threatened with closure. Hundreds of people would lose their jobs. The union had lost the fight, and Scott, seeing the injustice of it, would rise up and run for shop steward and take on the bosses and lead the workforce on a strike, which would somehow, I hadn't quite worked this bit out, but would somehow save the steel mill and everyone's jobs, and he would do ballroom dancing at night. And of course, there was a really interesting parallel because as Scott became politicised at work, he found the courage to take on the corrupt powers that be in the ballroom dancing world and to finally dance his own steps. But that was the B story. Anyway, in the film's climax, the fight seems lost. The bosses will win. The bosses always win. The steel mill will close. And Scott has to make a brilliant speech to rally the workforce to the cause. The problem is he's meant to be at the final qualifying championship ballroom dancing competition. So he's making the speech. The workers are rallying. They're calling his name on the dance floor. Fran is looking anxiously at the door, tears in her eyes, and his enemies, Bill Hunter, etc., who also happens to own the steel mill, are smiling smugly, triumphantly. But somehow, through the magic of cinema, he makes the speech, changes his clothes, and makes it to the dance floor in a brilliant slide across the floorboards to arrive at Fran's feet. And they dance until suddenly there is silence. The baddies have switched the music off, but somewhere in the crowd someone is clapping out a beat. His father, who is wearing blue overalls and is one of the steel workers who had agreed to capitulate to the boss's demands early in the film. And then someone else is clapping and someone else, and Scott looks up and sees an army of steel workers marching into the dance hall and clapping the beat, urging them on. And so they dance, and the little kids sort out the sound system so the music comes back on, and everyone joins the floor and love is in the air. And Baz, to his credit, to his great sense of collaboration, went with it, though sometimes with a slight look of concern, through one draft of 250 pages, through a second draft of 182 pages, through a third draft of 150 pages, until he sat me down and he said, "You know, I think the film is about ballroom dancing. And everything you were trying to say can be said through the metaphor of dance." And he was right. I left the project on good terms and with mutual respect in place. And Baz brought on his good friend Craig Pearce, who had a much clearer understanding of what was needed. And the rest is history. Strictly Ballroom remains one of the most loved and commercially successful films ever made in Australia, and I was lucky to be a part of it. Several years later, the juxtaposition between the world of a blue-collar workforce on strike and the world of dance didn't seem like such a bad idea given the success of Billy Elliot. Ahead of my time, perhaps, but good ideas are easy. Then I simply didn't have the experience or the craft to pull it off. I was just too raw as a screenwriter. I tell my kids that it doesn't matter if you make a mistake, as long as you learn from it. It's a cliche, but I believe it. Problem is, I haven't always followed my own advice. Many years after Strictly Ballroom, and with a good deal more experience under my belt, I made the same mistake of overcomplicating a film script. I've spoken about Edge of Darkness at previous events, so I won't go over it again here, except to say that I was trying to write a film that would be a critique of post-9/11 American foreign policy, in particular neoconservatism, when in the end, what the producers really wanted was a revenge thriller in which the protagonist shot his way to redemption, a classic American genre film, and that's what they got. The easy lesson is to make sure you know what film the producers want and to know whether you can deliver it. The problem is they don't always know what film they want. They want you to tell them. That is your job, and so you do. And then when you give it to them, they realise they didn't want that after all. And so they sack you and get someone else to fix it. That's Hollywood. But I point the finger at myself here. The mistake was mine. I tried to stick a round peg in a square hole. I overplayed the politics. It's the playwright in me. I look for the cause, for the thing that must be revealed, the wrong that must be put right. I was a playwright on the loose in Hollywood. God help them. I wasn't the first. I won't be the last. I wonder sometimes whether being a playwright with those instincts is compatible with working in the film industry. I think it is if you can achieve an alchemy between political intent and story, if you can set a story about human need and desire within a political context. The question is, do audiences want it? A quick study of box office figures would suggest they don't. Most of the audience continues to look to cinema to escape from the lives they lead, rather than to be confronted by them. And so should we write to that audience alone? The call in Australian cinema from some quarters in the last few years has been that we should. Write films that people actually want to see, they say. What does that mean? Write films with happy endings? Write films about likeable people? Write films that give people a sense of hope? Fair enough, but those films will always be written, and plenty of films that set out to do exactly that fail anyway. If we heed this call, it is the films that don't set out to do that which are at risk. The tougher films, the darker films, the political films. The point is that we want Boxing Day and Red Dog, don't we? The former is an experiment in form and a brutal portrait of a man spiralling into darkness, which hardly anybody saw, and the latter a crowd-pleasing huge success. Both films made by the same filmmaker, Kriv Stenders. Both films, in my opinion, of value. The point is we want Snowtown and the Castle. We want the Sapphires and Samson and Delilah. We want the light and dark, don't we? My son Manny is a Liam Neeson fan. He says, "Dad, why can't you write a film like that, like Taken or Taken 2? And I say, because life's not like that. But it might also be because I'm not clever enough. And anyway, I quite like Liam Neeson films as well. But I'm not interested in escaping anything. I love a film that tells it as it is. I like a savage, brutal, miserable account of life. I quite like a melancholy mood. I'm not afraid of the dark, of human failing. I don't always want to see someone win in the end. I admire a film that earns my tears. And what makes me cry more than anything is when a film reveals just how savage or banal life can be and that a human being can survive it. And of course, the assumption that a political film is tougher and darker in tone and therefore less likely to appeal to a broader audience is wrong. A story about 4 young Aboriginal women overcoming racism in 1968 to realise their dream is one kind of political film. The Sapphires has made more than $10 million at the box office. Admittedly, a happy ending and life-affirming. It could be argued that mainstream Australian audiences are prepared to embrace Indigenous stories only if they don't remind them too much of a history and legacy of genocide and racism. But I'm not going to make that argument here. The film is a great success and we are all celebrating. And then there's Samson and Delilah, a much smaller audience, but not an insubstantial one, and a film that takes us right into the heart of that damaging legacy. Critically recognised by the industry and embraced by an audience that wants to think seriously about the country we all live in, that film earned my tears. Often it's much about whose stories are told and who appears on screen, which qualifies a work as being political. The television series The Slap, based on the Christos Tsiolkas novel, captures an Australia I recognise. The Lebs, the Greeks, the Italians, the Muslims are no longer just on SBS, no longer the neighbours, the comic relief, the best mate and support act. They are in the main house, placed right at the centre of the frame, and Australian audiences embraced it because they were seeing themselves and their lives represented truthfully. Excuse me. So I'm a playwright with a political impulse, always looking for a way to land it safely in the context of film, or preferably dangerously. I've made mistakes and I've pushed the politics too hard, but I'm also guilty of doing the opposite and letting the politics slip away from a project, softening it on the assumption that a more palatable version might prove to draw a broader audience. I want to talk about the film Blessed. It is one of those Australian films that came and went, one of those Australian films the taxi driver never saw. I said I was going to speak frankly. Well, I'm about to, but I want to frame this in terms of the mistakes I made and leave others to reflect on their own. As a screenwriter, I pride myself on being able to work collaboratively with the director towards realising the vision for the film. That vision is built first through the relationship between the screenwriter and director and producer. I've experienced that relationship at its best with Ray Lawrence and Jan Chapman on Lantana, and more recently with Anton Corbin, Gail Egan, Andrea Calderwood, and Stephen Cornwell, the director and producers of A Most Wanted Man. I'm often asked, what is the secret to a successful collaboration? It's really simple. There are 2 points. The first is to say yes to other people's ideas. The good ideas will last and the bad ones will fall by the wayside. But if you say no at the beginning, the idea is never tested and you might just never know if it would have flown. And in the meantime, you've silenced your collaborator. The second secret to a successful collaboration is not to seek to control the outcome. This one is a little more complex, a little more difficult. It requires trust and confidence in the people you're working with, and above all, the capacity to put your ego aside. This sits at odds with the very idea that a film is the result of the sole vision of a director. Is it possible that in Australia we genuflect to the idea of the director as auteur too readily, and therefore the director, feeling that the vision is theirs to carry alone, often fails to deliver it? The alternative is to argue for the potential of a collective vision, a radical approach, perhaps, until you realise that most television drama is actually the result of a shared vision arising from the collective work of a creative team. And it's worth pointing out that the most interesting, the most compelling, the most groundbreaking storytelling of the past decade or so has been taking place on the small screen. I wonder if it's time for cinema, which has always regarded itself as the superior form, to take a lesson from the way television drama is created. At the end of the shoot on Lantana, Ray Lawrence printed up a T-shirt for everyone involved in the film. On the front it said Lantana, on the back it said a film by, and then it listed the names of everybody who had anything to do with the film in alphabetical order, from the director himself to the names of the catering crew. A symbolic gesture, but one that reflected the spirit in which the film was made. Ray also chose not to have a possessory credit, such as a Ray Lawrence film, at the front of the picture, opting instead for a simple directed by in the end credits. Another indication, I think, of the spirit in which the film was made. I'm not entirely opposed to the possessory credit if someone has conceived, written and directed a film, but I balk at it when the film's writer has generated the original idea. Ray and Jan made 3 important gestures towards me as a screenwriter. The first was to ask me to be on set as much as possible. The second was to hold a reading of the screenplay with the cast for the crew and all involved in the film. It served to share the story with everybody who was about to make it, and it was a mark of respect to the screenplay and its writer. It said, this document matters. The third thing was to welcome me into the edit room, not just welcome me, but to recognise that my insights were of value. I hold Lantana up as a model for a successful collaboration in film, and I believe that the film's success reflected the way in which it was made. It has become something of a benchmark against which I measure other films. Like Lantana, Blessed was based on a play. It was called Who's Afraid of the Working Class and came out of a collaboration between myself, Patricia Cornelius, Melissa Reeves, Christos Chalkas and Irene Vella. It was written for Melbourne Workers Theatre and directed by Julian Merrick to mark the company's 10th anniversary. It told the stories of a number of largely unrelated characters as they negotiated their way through difficult lives made even more difficult by the impact of economic rationalism. These were the people whose lives were not made better by the transformation of the Australian economy that took place in the 1990s. It was a play about the people who were left behind. On opening night, the 5 writers sat in the back row and we held each other's hands. We did not know how what we had written would be received. The play was as much a critique on the failure of the left as it was on the right and economic rationalism. It felt like a risk was being taken, and theatre is at its most potent when something is at risk. By the end of the opening monologue, delivered by a 17-year-old boy who described giving head to Jeff Kennett in a lift at Parliament House, we knew the audience was with us. And we knew they were with us as they laughed at the story of 2 WOG girls wagging school out on a shoplifting spree and sticking their finger up in defiance at all who said they weren't smart enough, pretty enough, thin enough, white enough, good enough. And they gasped as they witnessed an Aboriginal man wearing a suit telling a white woman that her cunt smelt like death. And you could hear a pin drop during the play's moments of emotional revelation, as a woman called Rhonda described the death of her 2 children from a fire in a charity bin and screamed in rage at the futility of her life, set to the sound of Irene's haunting cello composition. And people wept as Comfort Woman, as we called her, described a moment of intimacy found in caring for a stranger while she felt so estranged from the very people she was meant to love. There is nothing so powerful in the theatre than the sound of the silence of 200 people listening. There were cheers at the play's end. There were people wiping their eyes. The applause was long and genuine. The play had struck a raw nerve. It named something through the power of theatre that people were feeling at the time but were struggling to express. It gave voice to the disempowered and raised a spirit of defiance in its audience. The season was a sellout. A national tour followed, and the play has since taken its place in our theatre's canon as being one of Australia's more important political plays. It was optioned a few years later, around 2002, and eventually found its way to the screen in 2009 as an Anna Kokonos film called Blessed. A 7-year journey. The film split its audience. Some people found it deeply moving, others found it unrelentingly bleak and inauthentic. I don't want to talk much about the film itself because people have the right to their own responses, to like it or not, or to feel indifferent. But what I'm interested in, what I'm trying to understand, is why the play brought its audience together whilst the film left its audience divided. What happened? What changed? And more generally, what can our film industry learn from this case? I have a theory that as the work moved from the shared vision of 4 writers and a composer, later to broaden to include the vision of the play's director and its cast, to the single vision of a filmmaker, something intrinsic to the spirit of the work was lost. And I believe that if we had been able to extend the collective vision of the play through to the film, the work would have retained its power to unify its audience. So what happened? The first mistake I made was to be seduced by the argument that 4 writers could not write this film, that the process would be too unwieldy, too difficult to manage, that 4 writers could not be trusted to produce a unified screenplay, and that as the most experienced film writer in our group, I should write the film myself. That was the director's argument, and I agreed with it. Fortunately, my colleagues didn't and told me to pull my head in. And to their credit, the director and then producer reconsidered and agreed that the 4 of us would write it. But something had happened. A hierarchy had been named where there had not been one previously. In our collaboration, no one's voice was given more importance than anyone else's. Now it was implicit that my voice would carry more weight than the other writers, and it was a crucial mistake. The play's success was in the coming together of different voices, not in the ascendancy of a single voice. And I'm curious why this is more possible in the theatre than in film. The second mistake was to accept, without more rigorous examination, the argument that the director would choose the composer for the film. Of course, it was her film, her vision, her right, and she chose to work with a very experienced and respected film composer. The consequence of this, though, was that the five of us who created the underlying work became four. Irene Vella was not just the composer of the play, she was a key member of the collaboration, responsible for the vision of the work and credited as one of its writers. But because her language was music and our language was words, we got to continue and she didn't. Irene accepted the situation with good grace and perhaps a degree of resignation, but something was ruptured. We should have fought harder to retain the integrity of our collaboration. And the film lost the opportunity to work with a distinctive voice in Australian contemporary music. It was an opportunity missed. I wish we had the strength and the status and the confidence at the time to have said, it's five of us, take it or leave it. What is the worst that could have happened? The film wouldn't have been made. So be it. We would have lived. After two drafts, a significant shift in the work took place. There was a sense that the script wasn't working, but the draft was no more problematic than the second draft of a screenplay written by a single writer. It was no worse, say, than the second draft of Lantana or A Most Wanted Man. It was very much a work in progress. However, I led an argument backed by the director to restructure the film around two halves, and crucially, around a series of relationships between mothers and their children. In the process, the title was changed from Who's Afraid of the Working Class to Blessed. At the time, this felt like a breakthrough. I was excited by this new structure, and the new title seemed at the time to work well. After a lot of debate and in the spirit of collaboration, we all embraced it, but not without concern that something was being lost. With hindsight, I can see what was happening. And I think my co-writers saw this before I did. The change in title indicated a softening of the film. It was losing its political edge, and in the process, the characters and storylines that were more political in their content were being put at risk in favour of the storylines that were more emotional. The hardness was being taken out of it and being replaced by something softer, more benign. It was subtle, but the characters were losing the sense of defiance that defined them in the play. Instead of fighting against the economic circumstances that threatened to impoverish them, they seemed already beaten by it in the film. And in their defiance there was dignity, there was life. Without it, they were reduced to being merely victims. James Parker was a crucial character in the play. In many ways, he was its most damaged soul. He was an Aboriginal man, a member of the professional class, a man who wore a suit. He was played by Glenn Shea and Tony Briggs in the play and by Wayne Blair in the film. On hearing that his mother has passed away, he is called into the morgue to identify the body. On seeing the woman laid out, he disowns her. This woman is not my mother. The woman is white. As his story unfolds, we learn that he was an Aboriginal child who has been brought up by a white woman, Laurel, who valued education above anything else. She thought she was doing the right thing, giving the boy an opportunity he wouldn't have had being Aboriginal in this country. She thought she was saving him from something. His birth mother visited on the boy's birthday, but when she knocked on the door, Laurel didn't answer. She pretended she wasn't home. The mother left her gift, a cowboy and Indian set, on the doorstep and went away. As she looked back, she saw her son watching her from an upstairs window. He turned away. There was an unspoken act of collusion taking place between Laurel and James to shut the mother out of their lives. They never spoke of it, but both of them would come to pay a price for this collusion. James grew up and became an insurance assessor. He was good at his job. He knew how to measure damage. He had a senior position in the firm. He wore a fine suit, but he was still seen through the prism of his colour, still trapped by it. He'd made his choice as a boy to take his place in the white world, but the world he chose didn't really want him. It felt threatened by this black guy in a suit who thought he had some power over them. And meanwhile, he was left alienated from a world he could have belonged to, his mother's world. In one crucial scene, we see James Parker hire a white prostitute and verbally abuse her until she complies with his desire to be racially vilified. "Bung, nigger, filthy abo," she screams in his face. And it is this abuse that allows him to reach a sexual climax. It is a scene about self-loathing and how racism gets turned inward so that you end up hating yourself and becoming the very thing white people fear you are. Eugenia Fragos played the part of Claire, the prostitute in the play and the film. It was a hell of a scene in both, but she and Wayne Blair pulled off a frighteningly honest and confronting scene for the film, the kind of scene you hope to see in a film, uncomfortable to watch, impossible to look away from, transgressive. As actors, they were both so courageous. The character of James, and particularly that scene, had always been contentious, but it was this very contention that made it so compelling. The scene was brutal and the character deeply ambivalent. It was a pivotal moment in the play, but as the work morphed into something called Blessed, a softer, more emotional world based around a series of broken relationships between mothers and their children, this role was brought into question. People didn't like him. I think that was the point. But we were having to argue for the retention of the character against an argument that he was unlikable and therefore didn't belong in the film. We kept being asked to soften him, to redeem him, in effect, to make him more palatable, less threatening, less angry, less powerful, really. As shooting approached, I thought we had won the argument and that the director believed in the scene as we did. We spoke about it often, again and again, how important it was, how excited we were by it. I asked for her assurance that the scene was safe, and she gave it to me. I was asked to view the film once during the edit. Curiously, the other three writers were not invited to see it at this stage. It was still early, and the director was still wrestling with the material, still trying to find the film, so I respected her preference not to have us all at once. It is a confronting thing for a writer to view the edit at this early stage. You need to quickly come to terms with what's not there, what was lost along the way. You're reeling, really, silently grieving those losses, and you need to let go of what you hoped the film might be and accept what it is. It is unfair on the director to say too much. Best, I think, to encourage and support and try to be a sounding board. The contentious scene with James Parker and Claire was still there. I found it very powerful. I felt that it shifted the energy of the film, that it gave it some needed bite, that it ramped up the tension, that something was being put at risk. There were a series of questions being asked around it, but no more than some other scenes. I asked again if the scene was safe. The director said it was. I said that if that changed, then please let's talk about it. I left Melbourne feeling reassured. I passed on that reassurance to the other writers. 3 weeks later, when the other three writers were allowed to see the film, the scene was gone. Every screenwriter in this room knows what that feels like. They know what it means to lose material that you care about and believe in. We've probably all got stories about our favourite scenes that didn't make the cut. And ultimately, the edit is the responsibility of the director. We understood that, so get over it. It's not that the scene was cut, it's how it was cut. We weren't included in the decision. We weren't warned. We weren't even asked for an opinion. On discovering it, we tried to make a case for its reinstatement, but were told that the decision was made, the door was closed, in our face, slammed shut. It was shocking. If we were forewarned, yes, we would have fought it passionately. There might have been raised voices, a few tears, a little blood on the floor even. But in the context of a collaboration, a decision is eventually reached and the process allows for mutual respect to remain in place. Someone loses. I suspect it would have been us, but we would have lived with it if we'd had a say. And then we found out that between the two showings of the film, the director had invited a group of her friends to view it. I wasn't there, so I don't know how the conversation went. But some of the people spoke to us later, and it seems that it was generally felt by this group that the film would be better without the scene. As it happened, this group were all women and were all white. I make this point only in the context that they were being asked to comment on a scene about black male anger. If the scene was to be tested against audience opinion, then perhaps the test group should have been more diverse. Being sensitive to the content of the scene, the writers sought the opinion of Indigenous friends and colleagues when it was first conceived and written and performed, and received their endorsement. It seemed to me that the director and the producer got the answer they wanted, and all that this process achieved was to alienate the writers and to ensure that some of the most courageous work in the film ended up on the cutting room floor. The point is not that the opinions of a group were canvassed. The point is that we were excluded from this conversation. We were not asked to participate, to witness it, to counter it, to offer another view. There is nothing wrong with the director seeking the counsel of trusted friends, but there is something wrong when the opinion of this group carries more weight and is given more value than the people who wrote the film and the people who created the underlying work. This happens in Hollywood often, but even in Hollywood, the writer is often engaged in the conversation. Why wouldn't they be? And this is not just about the writers of this particular film. I say this on behalf of all writers in this industry. We are not the enemy. Don't treat us as such. We were left completely disempowered by the making of this film, humiliated in fact. I go to the end of the earth to write a screenplay. I go way beyond the call of duty, way beyond what I'm paid for. I just keep writing until we all agree that it's right, that it's ready, and I'm always the last one to say so. I've only had a hard time on one other film, Edge of Darkness, but then I was paid to get shafted and it didn't hurt so much. This hurt. In my 20s, I believed that there were an infinite number of stories to tell and that I would get around to telling most of them. It was all ahead of me. That's what being young is about. I continued to believe that through most of my 30s. Somewhere in my 40s, I began to suspect that I wouldn't get to tell them all. And now, on the eve of turning 50, I know that the number is finite and a lot smaller than I ever imagined it could be. So when one goes wrong like Bless did, it breaks your spirit a little. The best antidote for a broken spirit is to write, and that is what we have continued to do, each with our own work, and importantly together. But now the 5 of us have become 6. Eugenia has joined our collaboration. She has performed in all our work over a number of years and now joins us as a writer. We are currently working on a project. Ironically, it is called Bereft, which is pretty much how we felt at the end of our journey on Blessed. The film rights are available as long as you don't mind if the 6 of us write it together and you're not afraid of an argument when there needs to be one. In A Most Wanted Man, I feel as though I might have at last found that elusive balance between a political context and the needs of genre. The film tells the story about a young Chechen man who comes to Germany seeking refuge from the violence of his native Chechnya. But because of the mistrust that characterises the West's relationship with Islam since 9/11, we don't know how to read him. We suspect he wants to hurt us. Our fear of Islam has taken away our capacity to recognise innocence and genuine human need. The story could well be set in our own country, except our young man would come from Afghanistan or Iraq or Sri Lanka. I'm not going to talk the film up. It's bad luck to do so. It will be what it will be. But in the combination of John le Carré's deeply humanist novel, Anton Corbijn's cool and enigmatic European aesthetic, and my search for the balance between genre and politics, there is the potential for a gripping, compassionate and intelligent film. If the film is a success, and if its success is at all due to the quality of the writing, then it will be because I was given the room to find the story I wanted to tell by the author, the director, and the producers, and because all of them have a deep respect for writers and what they can do. Under such conditions, a writer can do his or her best work. Lately in the theatre, it has been claimed that a play has no inherent literary value. It is simply a working document, a stepping stone towards the realisation of a director's vision, a set of instructions that he may or may not follow. This argument, you won't be surprised, is made by directors who seek to bring an auteur's approach to the theatre. Witness the controversy around Belvoir Street Theatre's production of Death of a Salesman. Simon Stone, the director, cut the final scene and by so doing changed the meaning of the play's conclusion. Miller's estate found out and threatened to withdraw the licence. I understand that the company has now agreed to reinstate the scene. My feeling about this is that Simon, undoubtedly talented, and I say this with respect, hasn't earned the right to change Miller's meaning, and that the company should have cautioned him against it for no other reason than they didn't have the permission to do it. It is a mark of disrespect to have proceeded without it, and if any playwright has earned respect, it is Arthur Miller. There is a crucial difference between reimagining a play for your own time and place and changing the meaning of the work. I'm not a traditionalist, and I don't believe a play should be preserved in aspic, but to change the meaning is to claim authorship. There is a school in our theatre now that is preoccupied with re-engaging the classics in this way, and in the spirit of debate in our theatre, I'd like to say to this school, write your own plays and stop effing around with everybody else's. It's easy, it's conservative, and it ignores the vibrancy of the contemporary voices that surround you. Those of us who write for the screen are familiar with the argument that the screenplay is a blueprint, the architectural plan for the film. It has no artistic value or point beyond it. Some of us might actually agree with it. I don't hold that view. Architectural plans are more than a set of instructions. They contain a vision. So does a screenplay. The screenplay must capture the imagination and inspire the director and the other artists, particularly the actors who will work on it. It must enable them to do their best work by engaging their instincts. It must win the confidence of those who will finance it. It must carry the possibility of the film and evoke the experience that will be offered to an audience. It must convey pace and rhythm and tone. It must offer the most vivid images and reveal the complexities of human behaviour, not through the interior voice of the novel, but through what a character does, what a character says, and what a character fails to say. A good screenplay is like a fine poem, where the most amount of meaning possible is expressed with as fewer words as possible, where what sits on the page is the tip of the iceberg and the portal to a depth of meaning that is often left unsaid in order to allow room for the camera to reveal what's hidden. Often the best dialogue in a film simply frames the moment. Writing a screenplay is about creating the space for an actor to fill. The camera is at its most revealing in the spaces between what is said, in the silence and stillness of the moments in between. And of more and more interest to me as a writer is not what a character says, but their struggle to say it, their search for meaning in the words they use to describe their world. Not so much what they convey, but their failure to convey it. That's art. That's literature. That's whatever you want to call it, but it's not just a set of instructions that may or may not be followed. When I was younger, my friends called me Clark, as in Clark Kent. I had a different set of glasses then and different coloured hair. Sometimes I still feel like Clark Kent, a little awkward, a little inconsequential. And sometimes I feel like Bruce Wayne, a little dark, a little weird. And then I put on my metaphorical writer's cap and I discover cape, and I discover powers I didn't know I had. Maybe I am a gun for hire. But what a work says matters to me. Just cause matters to me. Collaboration matters to me. The people I work with matter to me. Maybe I'm a superhero, but I don't have a cape and I can't fly faster than the speed of sound. Instead, I have grey hair and glasses, and I can type really fast when I have to. But like all superheroes, I'm flawed, and my alter ego as a writer is my cover. But when the job is done, I quite like taking off my cape and just hanging out with Lois Lane for a while. Whatever I am, I'm just so lucky and honoured to be a writer. So I'm in a taxi, and we've just cleared the airport. True story. And the taxi driver says, "Here on business?" And I say, "Yeah." And he says, "So what do you do?" And I think about lying. I think about all the other things I could be. I think about that garden. But I say I'm a writer. And he says, "Yeah? What do you write?" And I'm not up for the conversation, so I say I'm a playwright. I write plays. And he says, "Yeah, I saw a play once. Something about rain. Starts with this guy on stage. And he screams, and a fish falls out of the sky and lands at his feet." "Yeah," I say. "What was it about?" And he says, "Fucked if I know, mate, but it was bloody good." Thanks for listening.